Please welcome Jeremy Bailenson. He is a professor of communication at Stanford University and founding director of the Virtual Human Interaction Lab. And he has a new book out called Experience on Demand, What Virtuality Is, How It Works, and What It Can Do, and it is available for sale in the back. And now please welcome Jeremy Bailenson.
Thanks. Hi, so my name is Jeremy Bailenson, and since the late 1990s, I have been building immersive virtual reality and testing its effect on the brain. My PhD is in cognitive psychology, but in the year 2003, I switched to Stanford University, where I'm in the Department of Communication. Basically, what I do is I build virtual reality, and I test to see what works, what doesn't work, and we study virtual reality as a medium the same way you would study the newspaper or the way you study television. The key to virtual reality is something called presence. Presence is defined by Matthew Lombard as the illusion of non-mediation. When VR works well, there's no gadgets, there's no pixels, there's no field of view, you're just having an experience. So this is a lab demo we call the virtual pit. What happens in the virtual pit is you're wearing the equipment and you see a 3D model of the room. The floor opens up in the 3D model of the room. It looks just like the physical room. We drop a chasm, it's about 10 meters deep, and we lay a plank across the chasm. Now let me go back to the year 2001. We presented at the Federal Judicial Center in Washington, D.C., a demonstration about how one would use virtual reality in the court system, for example, to recreate crime scenes. And we were giving a demo to a federal judge. He was a large man, probably in his late 60s. And when he was walking across that plank that you see, he just took a little baby step to his left. Of course, we modeled gravity, and we stepped off the physical plank. Visually, he plummeted towards the bottom of that pit. Now, if you wanted to save your life, the way you would save your life would be to dive across to catch the other end of that lip. And so here we are in Washington, D.C., this is near 2001, and this federal judge in the physical world just decides to dive at a 45-degree angle. It gets worse. This is my first public demo, and we put the computer on a table that had a sharp corner. Okay, so here is this judge in a room full of lawyers, and he dives towards this corner. He was okay. He didn't actually hurt himself. He didn't cut himself. But this exemplifies something called presence. And for most of the people in this room and a lot of the people watching this video, you have done VR. You know there's something special about what makes VR feel different than other media. At my lab at Stanford, since 2003, we've published hundreds of studies that show what works in VR from a psychological standpoint, how it's different than other media. In my lab, we've got a floor that shakes. We've got a very accurate tracking system that can move sounds around the room. We've got haptic devices that can move your arms. We started working with virtual scent. That being said, the lab as a physical destination is becoming obsolete because some of the smart people in this room here at Google and other companies are transforming the availability of virtual reality. So if you look in this image here, on the right side of your screen, if you go to my lab's website, 80% of our publications are using these head-mounted displays. They weigh up to 5 pounds. They cost more than my car. They're really heavy, kind of bulky to use. The ones that we're using now cost the price of an expensive dinner, a couple $100s. And so what we've done is we've gone from when I started this work, there was only a couple hundred head-mounted displays, to now we've got tens of millions. And that drastically changes the questions that we try to ask in the lab. When I first started, virtual reality, we thought of it like an MRI machine. Expensive, you needed a dedicated space, you needed a technician to run it, and this transition to now tens of millions of people in the United States are doing VR in their homes. It's an important transition in the history of the field. So the point of this talk is to answer the question that my 91-year-old grandfather had when I first put him in virtual reality, which is, really what's the point? So a lot of people have had this experience. You put on VR, it feels really cool, but then you take it off and you're like, okay, I did that, and now what do I do? And what we specialize as a lab is focusing on the things that make VR spectacular and avoiding the things that maybe aren't so good. And what I'm going to do today in this talk, which is something I haven't done before, but I'm going to start doing it, is talking about both the downsides of VR and the upsides. And I think it's important to talk about both. So this is an image from the cover of my book, and we spent a lot of back and forth going back and forth. We spent a lot of time going back and forth with the artist, and the cover is a shape that's impossible. This shape can't exist in the world. However, people are doing normal things on it, everyday things. And virtual reality, there's a paradox. The brain treats it as real. Remember that judge dove into nothing, but there's no rules. You can go back in time. You can turn physics on and off. You can become a different person. And so what I spend 12 hours a day thinking about and studying is, in a world in which there are no rules, very new to human history from an evolutionary standpoint, but the brain treats it as real, what should you do and what should you avoid? So I'm going to start by talking about the downsides. I just took this photo 45 seconds ago, and I luckily did not get run over on New York City streets here. But in a non-funny version of this, there's reports out of Moscow 4 weeks ago that we have the first VR death. A person fell through a plate glass table while using VR to play games. Smartphones now are so distracting it's causing people to cause accidents. VR will be no different. Kediki Sriram just turned in her dissertation, which is now available in public databases. In her dissertation, she put people in VR, and she tested to see how quick they were to notice events outside of VR. For example, if something touches your hands. What she proved was that when you're in immersive VR, you're slower to notice and less likely to notice things in the outside world. It's an important one. We need to think about how not to be too distracted so we can function in the world. Addiction. When social networking feels like the best party you've ever been to, when online gambling feels like going to Las Vegas, when pornography feels like sex, how does society function? Reality blurring. I'm going to read you this quote. Several times during the experiment, the participant was confused about being in the virtual environment or in the real world and mixed certain artifacts and events between both worlds. This is a quote from two German psychologists from the University of Hamburg who studied a paper in 2014 where one of them watched the other one while he stayed in virtual reality for 24 hours straight. So to prepare for this talk, I called up Gerhard Bruder, who's the second author on this paper. A lot of strange things happened. One of the things that happened is that they actually modeled light to work in the virtual world to correspond with the actual time of day. And when the virtual room got dark, the subject got colder. The temperature changes to the body, self-reported, were mediated by what they saw in VR. It's going to be a strange world if people spend too much time in VR. Simulator sickness. We all work hard to make sure that our technology's got high frame rates, low update rates. We try not to move the camera, but it's still something to think about over time. You can feel fatigued. Media modeling. Let's avoid the desensitization of violence debate for now, but VR has been used to train soldiers for decades. Most VR labs have been funded by research to help our soldiers get better at their jobs. When the average citizen can download software that teaches her or him how to do combat, we need to think about that. There's some issues there. Kids are unique, so we are about to publish a few things I want to talk about today. With Common Sense Media, we have a report coming out in late March that's going to be a helpful report for parents to think about when is it okay for kids to go into VR, what types of things should they do, how long can they stay in there. But my former PhD student, Jackie Bailey, is now a professor at University of Texas, and her dissertation research worked with Sesame Street. Sesame Street funded a project for us to take 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, and 6-year-olds, put them in VR, and study the way they would interact with Grover. And so I'll show you this movie, and you'll just get a sense of the reaction that kids have in VR.
Get both of them. I'll have them do a couple things for us. Okay, ready? Oh, hello there! It's Design, your lovable furry friend Grover. Get up out of your chair and dance with us. Follow our crazy moves. You can do it. All right.
So we've now run north of 100 kids who are 6 years or under in the lab, and what Jackie Bailey looks at is she looks at psychological processing such as being able to inhibit responses, mimicry, and social interaction, and she's found fairly drastic differences where VR is more influential on young children than a TV version of Grover. So it's something we need to think about. Now, we talked about 5 downsides of VR. Given those downsides, what I'm saying here today in this talk is that in 5 years from now, if the people in this room are putting on helmets to read their email, then I've failed as an evangelist. VR is an amazing technology. The brain treats it in a similar way to being real. It's something that can take us to different places. It's powerful. We should save it. Save it for things that in the physical world meet one of 4 standards: impossible, counterproductive, rare or expensive, or dangerous. And I'm going to go over each of these individually. But to sum up the take-home argument from today, VR is super intense. The brain treats it as if it were a real experience. Therefore, we shouldn't use it for everything. Let's save it for something that meets at least one of these standards. Let's start with impossible. In 2003, my lab, the first corporate grant we got was from Cisco, and a woman there named Marcia Satowski. Marcia said, Jeremy, it would be really neat if you could think about how to use VR to teach diversity and inclusion. And what we did is we built the virtual mirror. And I'm going to show you this video and be kind to it because I like to show history. These graphics now are 15 years old. And the idea was to use VR to induce what neuroscientists call body transfer. Body transfer states that if you move physically and your virtual avatar moves synchronously with you, you see that in a mirror, you see it in the first person. Over time, the brain, the part of the brain that includes the schema for the self, expands to include that virtual representation. So here in this movie, subject walks around. He goes up to the mirror. Most subjects do this for 4 minutes. I've kept it to about 10 seconds. He moves in the mirror, turns his head. After about 4 minutes, this really feels like it's you. We've got a set of instructions that we do. He then bends down at the knee, and he comes up, and he's now a woman of color. And what we do is the next step, we repeat the body transfer so you really feel like that's you in the mirror. And then what we do is we network a second person into virtual reality. So you're wearing the body of someone else, a second person comes in, and then that person proceeds to treat you horribly based on your race, based on your gender, based on your age. And what we've discovered in about 15 years of studying this fairly rigorously, this is described in chapter 3 of my book, it's called Walking a Miles in the Shoes of Another, is that in general, across these studies, virtual reality reduces prejudice, changes behaviors more than controls like watching a video or doing role-playing or reading case studies. Now, I don't want to overclaim the results. Nothing is magic. Nothing solves all of our problems, and not every single study does VR work better than controls on every single measure. But as a pattern, across over a decade of research, VR works better than controls. We published work in 2013. My former student, Sunju An, is now a professor at University of Georgia. She had subjects come in. Half of them imagined they role-played what it would be like to be colorblind while they were doing a sorting task. They had to grab objects and sort them around. The other half, we used the head-mounted display to take away their ability to see green from red. It was a brutally difficult and, in fact, impossible task to actually do because you had to sort items of different colors and you couldn't see that well. After the study was over, she gave subjects an opportunity to help people with disabilities. She didn't ask subjects to self-report. She paid them for the study and then said, if you want to volunteer extra, what you can do is you can surf the web, you can find websites that would be hard to read if you were visually impaired, and then you can email the webmasters and ask them to change it. When you become impaired in VR, you spend twice as much time helping others compared to when you imagined it. And most of our studies look at behavioral measures like that. We never trust when it comes to issues of implicit bias and prejudice. We don't trust self-report. We actually watch what people do. Another example, Hal Hirschfeld, who's now a professor at the business school at UCLA, he cared about empathy to yourself, and in particular, yourself in the future. A philosopher called Parfit has long argued that it's really easy to imagine pleasure soon. It's very hard to imagine pain in the future. Therefore, people rarely defer gratification. They tend to opt for pleasure now. How do you get people to push that back? And Hal ran a series of experiments. It was his dissertation work where in the virtual mirror, we actually scanned your face before you came in, so you saw yourself in the mirror and your face looked just like your actual you. We then used algorithms to age yourself so that you, in the mirror, you went from 20-something to, in your 60s or 70s. Very intense experience. You see yourself age in front of your eyes. What we would then do is give you the opportunity to take some money now, or give you more money later on if you were to put it into a savings account. In other words, he asked people to defer gratification. What Hal discovered over a series of experiments was that compared to just about every control condition you can think of, meeting your future self in virtual reality causes you to plan for the future better than controls. Now, we published this in the Journal of Market Research, which is a good academic journal, but one of the themes of today is watching this academic work we've been doing for a decade actually scale out to the world. And the funnest thing that we've done with this work is Bank of America Merrill Lynch has built what's called face retirement. And they figured out a way to use the laptops and the camera to do a scan of your face, and then they age yourself so that you are about 67 years old in this picture. And then part of your online banking interface, your future self is staring at you every decision that you make. And your future self gets happier the more money you put into savings, okay? And you know, at Stanford, we like win-wins. It's okay that BAML's gonna perhaps make more money because there's more money in their accounts. 20-somethings are saving money more. And this is important not just because they are going to be impoverished given the current trends of how people are savings, they're also going to live till they're 90 or 100. So getting people to save money is a really important goal, and we're working with a number of companies to help them encourage young people to put money in the bank. Another fun application of this to solve a problem that's not fun, and fun's the wrong word to use in this context. The National Football League has been very active in working with us as an organization to use this technology to help the members of their company or their organization, because they're a nonprofit, to become better. And Troy Vincent, the vice president of operations on the NFL, he really wants the NFL to be known as the best place to work. And what you're seeing here is a screenshot from an interview simulator that we've built in tandem with the NFL for, not players, for coaches, executives, for owners to basically practice having an interview. Why did you ask this question to this person but a different question to someone else? Why did you look in this place? And just like VR comes from the flight simulator, in interviews we also make mistakes. We have a flight simulator because mistakes are very expensive in a plane, but they're not expensive when you're simulating. We should learn by doing. And we've been working with the NFL to help their personnel become better at giving interviews and become less biased. It's a neat process to watch people do an interview and then do it again and to point out things that they can do better. Another example of scaling this up, at the 2016 Tribeca Film Festival, we premiered Becoming Homeless, and Tobin Asher is sitting right here. He's one of the directors of Becoming Homeless. It's a 7-minute journey where you learn in a visceral manner something called the fundamental attribution error. So psychologist Lee Ross from Stanford has coined the term, which basically states when something bad happens to someone else, we blame their character. When something bad happens to us, we blame the situation. And most people do this all the time. How can you reverse this in the context of becoming homeless? Meaning, how can we get people to understand that people are homeless because of situations and get them to have more empathy? And so what we've built is this 7-minute experience where you lose your job, you then lose your apartment and you can't stay there. You have to sell things in your apartment. You try living in your car, but that doesn't work. You then try to sleep on a bus and you have harassment on the bus. It's a very intense journey. But more importantly, we have run thousands of subjects through this now, thousands of subjects where we have people do VR or control condition, and what we give them is a petition. They take the helmet off, sign this petition. It's an actual proposition in many cases. Are you willing to have your own personal taxes increased if it can go to supporting affordable housing? And in a paper we're going to publish quite soon, in a paper that's already been accepted for presentation at a conference, so it's been peer-reviewed, compared to control conditions, VR causes more people to sign this petition. But what I'm really excited about scaling up is when we leave here, Tobin's going to be hard at work because tomorrow this is going to be released for the world on Steam. And so we're really excited just to take what the lab has built and to give it to people for free. Let's go to the next example, which is counterproductive. This bucket of, remember, we're talking about physical experience, things that in the real world would be counterproductive, hence let's do them in VR. And I'm going to focus on conservation. And one of my academic heroes is Dr. Jane Lubchenco. She was the head of the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration for 4 years under President Obama. In that 4-year window, she saw more natural disaster than in any 4-year window in U.S. history. Scientists are in consensus that the frequency and intensity of these weather events are due to climate change. But of course, there's many people, both in our government and among our citizens, who don't believe this. And so this quote from Dr. Lubchenco When people directly experience something, they see it in a different light. And I interviewed her for the book, and she told all these amazing stories. At NOAA, her job was, when there was a natural disaster, to go down and to help the people who had been hurt by the natural disaster. And she's got some amazing stories of lawmakers who were climate change deniers, but when natural disaster hit their city, they become believers. In other words, the horrors and the experience of droughts and floods that have ravaged their cities, have caused them to become believers. But remember, in virtual reality, disaster is free, okay? We can feel a disaster but not get hurt. And so the first study that we published here examined a phenomenon called toilet paper consumption. And it turns out there is an article written in 2009 by Leslie Coffin for the New York Times. If you use that soft, fluffy toilet paper that we all love, that paper is made from non-recycled pulp. About half of that comes from second growth forest. 10% of that comes from virgin trees. So the article is written brilliantly, but nothing changes. In San Francisco, where I live, in the Bay Area, it's the hippiest, crunchiest place in the country, and many stores don't sell recycled toilet papers. The ones that do sell it, you have to hunt and peck. So how do we change behavior? So we ran a study. 3 groups of subjects. One group read a beautifully written narrative of what it'd be like to cut down a tree. The second group saw a video shot from the shoulder of a lumberjack. The third put on the goggles and had a haptic device that gave them touch feedback, and they actually had to cut down 2 trees. And then after the trees fell, my lab has a floor that shakes, the tree falls, and it booms their feet up. Really intense experience. And in fact, I get phone calls quite often. Someone will call me up and they say, Jeremy, I went to that toilet paper aisle yesterday, and I thought about you. And I say, that's just fine. We tend not to trust self-report, though. So in our experiments, we did 2 things. We asked people before and after, are you going to conserve paper more? Everybody says yes, whether you read the narrative, saw the video, or did the VR. But we also looked at their actual paper use, and the only change occurred with the VR group. They used 20% less paper. So the big idea here is VR gives you experience, the brain treats it as real, and experience changes our behavior. But if I were to teach the people in this room about deforestation by forcing you to cut down big trees, that would be a silly way to do it. VR gives you the best of both worlds. The next project I want to talk about, because I'm hugely impressed what Google's done throughout its history about education. I've worked closely with the Expeditions team for quite some time. Is education. And I want to talk about a very special place that has been worked on by my marine science colleague, Theo McKelly. This is a reef off of the island of Ischia, which is off of Naples, Italy. And this island, this reef, has volcanic vents that seep pure carbon dioxide. This is special because most of the time that there's underwater volcano and underwater volcanic vents, it seeps methane or sulfur or other bad chemicals that you can blame the destruction on the reef on the bad chemicals. This is a pure area where you have CO2 coming out of the bottom of the ocean. And what you're looking here is a picture of what's called ocean acidification. So most smart adults have not heard of ocean acidification. Jane Lubchenco calls it global warming's evil twin. There's been papers published, hundreds of them in the best journals, Science and Nature, yet most adults don't know what it is. When oceans absorb CO2, about 1/3 of the CO2 produced by humans get absorbed by the ocean. The water becomes more acidic, the pH level goes down. The same way that when you drink seltzer, which has CO2 in it, it's a little more tangy, the water becomes more acidic. When the water becomes more acidic, what you see on your right side of the screen happens. Coral dies and algae thrives. And the entire food web under the ocean gets destroyed because the corals and other types of animals that support the ecosystem get replaced by a small number of species. So what you're looking at is a screenshot of how all of our oceans are going to look if our oceans continue to absorb human-produced CO2. But most people haven't heard of this, and it would be counterproductive for me to fly school kids and lawmakers to this small reef in Ischia, it's not much bigger than a soccer field, in order to learn this lesson. So we worked tirelessly with Theo McKelly, the marine scientist, and Roy P., who's an educational technologist, to build an 8-minute journey where you leverage all of the educational techniques that Roy P. has championed, experiential learning, all sorts of perspective taking. You become a scientist, you do species count, you get to travel through time, you really experience what ocean acidification is. And what we can demonstrate, we've published a number of papers here. The first thing is learning efficacy. We've put it in high schools. We've put it in college classes. Simply put, people learn well from virtual reality. It's a good starting point to get a lot of data on that. There's also motivation to learn. Which is, this is a screenshot from the 2016 Tribeca Film Festival, where we premiered the Stanford Ocean Acidification experience. It's an arcade that's open for, about 10 hours a day. Jane Rosenthal, the genius that put this together, it's an amazing, amazing set of experiences that people pay to come to. We had a line of, sometimes up to 100 adults waiting for up to an hour for about 10 hours a day for 7 days straight to learn about chemistry. And you don't see that for textbooks, and maybe it's a novelty thing and it'll wear off, but I've been doing VR for 20 years and the shock and awe for me is not worn off. So I do think the motivation piece will stay. We've done a lot of work to do this to inform policy. So we did a briefing at the U.S. Senate where we had senators and congresswomen and congressmen, in addition to their staffers, which you're seeing here in the picture, experience ocean acidification. And there was really two functions of this. One was teaching the lawmakers about ocean acidification, but for those who knew about acidification, we were teaching them about VR, and it was a really neat process. We just came back from Palau, which I'm not going to go into too much detail because I have limited time in this talk, where we did a similar briefing for Palauan lawmakers, but we actually created a demo, a targeted demo, to show the lawmakers how climate change was affecting the reefs in Palau, and it was a really neat experience to watch the VR demos that we gave as a briefing to the lawmakers become part of the policy decisions and the policy conversations. But most importantly, really happy that it's free and that we're giving it away. There's, at Stanford, we've got a history with MOOCs, which is can we democratize learning materials? And I believe even more than a MOOC, a 7-minute journey where you learn something new and exciting is going to really transform a lot of education, because very few people get to have labs, really good labs or really good field trips. And I'm not saying we should replace actual field trips with VR. I'm saying we should have field trips much more often. Let's move to expensive and rare. And this is going to be the story of learning and training. And it starts with Derek Belch. Derek Belch took my virtual people class in the year 2005. He was a field goal kicker for the Stanford team. After class, he said, "Jeremy, can we use VR to train athletes?" I said, "Derek, it's a brilliant idea, but the tech's not ready yet. Come back in 10 years. 10 years later, Derek came back to the lab. He got his master's thesis with me while he was an assistant coach on the Stanford football team. And he convinced Coach David Shaw, another brilliant forward-thinking person, to give us away 5 minutes of practice time on a Monday where we would film in spherical video. Back in 2013, it was really hard to do spherical video well. And our defense would pretend to be the team we were going to play that Saturday, and they would throw at us really complicated blitz packages and different defensive looks. The quarterback would go to the line of scrimmage, and he'd have to do one of three things. He'd let it roll, which is keep the original play. He'd kill, 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 which is go to the next play down the queue. Or he would ask a running back to move to pick up a block. So recognize a pattern, make a decision, communicate that decision. After 3 weeks, it was working so well that David Shaw decided to make it mandatory for practice. The Stanford team outperformed that season. I would never claim that, but Coach Shaw, as well as Kevin Hogan, our quarterback, highlighted this as one of the many tools that helped them do well that season. So it was a really neat thing to watch. Derek graduates January 2nd, 2015. And like many Stanford students, he forms a startup. It's called Striver. And what Derek has succeeded in doing is transforming the way athletes train. The first few months after starting this company, he thought he would have maybe a team or two. He signs 5 NFL teams to multi-year contracts, about a dozen college teams. And now this is just a sampling of some of the teams and companies that are using this. It is transforming the way that people are training. And the point here is not that we want to replace actual training. It's just an extra tool that you can use to get more mental repetitions. It helps you learn faster. It helps you learn in ways that are less dangerous. Now, in terms of scaling out, because it's really exciting to watch, companies like Google build things that can allow everyone to do VR. I want to talk about Walmart. I'm going to read you this quote. "From our test, we've seen that associates who go through VR training retain what they've learned in those situations better than those who haven't. Because of the promising results, we'll be rolling out this training to all 200 of our academy facilities by the end of 2017. That means the over 140,000 associates who will graduate from academics each year will have VR as an integral part of that experience." That's from a vice president of Walmart. The story of Walmart is we were demoing Arkansas's football trainer to someone from Walmart. He said, recognize a pattern? Making a decision and communicating that decision sounds like part of everybody's job. And what we did is we built a VR training demo for Walmart, and we put it in one single training academy. Walmart has 200 of them. Any Walmart employee can get in their car and drive in a day to get there. They do a boot camp where they spend a week learning. We put VR in one. You're probably all thinking, well, what do you learn in VR? And for Walmart, one example is holiday rush. All these people running at you, asking you to answer questions and screaming at you. Or another example is finding safety hazards in the room. There's actually a lot of use cases. So we started in one of these academies, very good qualitative data. We then went to 30 of them and paired the 30 academies using it to 30 who were not yet using it so we could run a controlled study. Very good quantitative data at scale. We are now in all of them, and I can say, I'm allowed to say in the year 2017, over 150,000 people got better at their jobs using virtual reality in similar techniques just to look around and get extra mental repetitions. And what goes into it is the motivation. It's fun to do. The efficacy, it's a better way to train because you feel like you're there. The final one I'm going to talk about, and we're short on time, so I'll be brief on this, is we should use VR for things that are dangerous in the physical world. And, you know, one of the most dangerous things that all of us do far too often is drive. Cars killed 40,000 people last year, 1.3 million people worldwide. You know, we're going to look back someday, and can you believe that we all got in these metal boxes, followed other people in metal boxes, and spent an hour each day going back and forth? And you know, we're not quite there where a face-to-face meeting, video conference doesn't work. I've been tirelessly working with my colleagues on trying to come up with a set of nonverbal features that are sufficient enough to do what I call the virtual handshake, feeling like you're really with someone. We've got a lot of work to do there, but you know, my plea to the brilliant people in this room and the brilliant people watching this video is let's make VR work. I don't want to get rid of face-to-face conversation. Go to that party, see your loved ones, but we don't need to drive to work every day to clack on a computer and then drive home. To sum up, Justice Alito had a concurring opinion in a famous court case in 2011. In the Supreme Court case, the US Supreme Court ruled that free speech trumped video game violence, meaning that any video game, no matter how violent, is free speech. And I'm a full believer in free speech. I'm very supportive of the Supreme Court and that, you know, people get to do art and we have free speech. That's what makes America so special. Alito wanted to flag something, though. He wrote what's called a concurring opinion, which is he agreed with the majority, but he wanted to flag an issue, and it was about immersive virtual reality. And in fact, Alito quotes my last book, Infinite Reality, and what he says is that I believe in free speech and it trumps other concerns, but there's something different about VR. There's something about it which it feels really real, and the same standards that we've been applying to normal 2D media might be a little different. So I don't come on stage today to give you an answer. I do agree with Justice Alito that there's something different about VR. Free speech trumps all, and we've got to figure out how to meld those two. The kind of take-home standard that I've come up with for me personally and my friends and family that call me up and they say, well, what should I do in VR? VR is meant for things that you cannot do in the real world. That's why it's there. But if it's something that you wouldn't do in the real world, that you'd feel bad about yourself, that you wouldn't want your friends to know you did, maybe that's not something you should be doing in VR. So on that note, I look forward to your questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
This caught my eye because as a consumer, I read about VR, I hear about it a lot, but it still seems very kind of at arm's distance as a consumer. Your arguments make perfect sense to me, but what's the tipping point for VR to become kind of more, I guess, accessible for the consumer? Like, what's the iPhone of VR?
So there's two things I'll say here. The first is when most people think about VR consumption, if you imagine a graph where the x-axis is years and the y-axis is numbers purchased, some people are a little bit sad at the slope of that curve. But for VR people that have been doing this for 20 years, if you pull out and you extend that x-axis, what you see is this whoop, really intense curve. And personally, I'm very comfortable at the rate that VR has been expanding. You know, we had a death in Russia, according to Moscow News. I'm thrilled we haven't had one in the United States. I'm just absolutely delighted by it. And I like the pace that we're going on. We need to learn a lot about this technology before all of us are walking around in these goggles all day long. So my first answer is, I know that you work at Google, and you want to reach people. That's what you guys do. I'm really comfortable with where we're at. The second answer to your question, more functionally, in my opinion, the roadblock in VR is content. And if you think about how long it took to get to Citizen Kane from the first moving picture, it took some time. And we just haven't nailed content yet. There's no reason to be in VR for that long. And so, if we give somebody demos, it's an hour-long demo session. Our longest one is 5 or 6 minutes. They do a lot of them. They're about a minute long. The content is not quite there yet to justify you clearing out a room in your garage and putting in this hardware. So you have to make great content, and then people will buy the widgets.
So I'm thinking back to that original anecdote that you opened up with about the judge who stepped off the plank and was diving at the. I would be that guy. I haven't been in that many VR simulations. You've been in countless, I'm sure. Does it wear off a bit? The reality wear off a bit? Do you kind of get used to it so you don't react that intensely?
I'll tell you a story. So with the plank demos, back when I was actually doing code, and now I'm just a figurehead that talks all the time. When I was programming my own pits and building the actual carving out the floor and laying that plank down, I got a little bit desensitized to that one. And I was able to kind of jump off and play because I'd spent so much time building it. When I visited one of my academic heroes, his name is Fred Brooks. He's a computer science professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He had a pit that just had, it wasn't the graphics, it was the tracking, was a higher update rate, more accurate, lower latency. And, it was my plan to show off in front of him and just kind of jump off the pit, but I was terrified and I couldn't do it. He put a napkin in my hand and my napkin coated with sweat. To close the loop on that, I went to go visit a company called Nomadic in San Rafael. They run these arcade systems, and I have to say they've got a better pit than I have in my lab. It's the pit. There's an actual wooden plank there, and it's really they warp it so that it wobbles, and they track the wobble so you see it in VR, and they've got wind going. But because of my lesson with Fred Brooks, I promised myself that I would never not step off a plank again, so I was able to overcome that. But it still got me. It hurt for me to do. I wanted to show off to these guys, and I was the first person in the history that ever stepped off their plank, but I had to really tell myself to do it.
So it sounds like it may be very specific to the environment that you've gotten very accustomed to.
So one of the questions I get in VR is, what's the effect of multiple doses? We're just starting to get a little handle on how long effects last with longitudinal studies, and about 5 or 6 really rigorous studies will tell you that the effects of VR, of these treatments for empathy, et cetera, if you look, say, 2 months later, it's still outperforming the others. So we're starting to get a handle on that. But in terms of the number of doses, doing VR 10 times, 50 times, the one data point we have historically is for the folks that use VR to treat phobias. So before there was this consumer revolution, there was a lot of brilliant people who were using VR to teach fear of public speaking, fear of heights, fear of spiders, and it typically with systematic desensitization, what you have there is people come back for multiple sessions. And so at least with those data points, it's still intense for them over time in the fear context. But your larger point, which is all of these things are going to matter on what you're doing, I totally agree with. It's, I try not to overgeneralize. Sometimes I do, but
thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, thanks for coming. Curious about you. So you just mentioned about your optimism in VR generally. Can you talk about that vis-a-vis optimism for AR and the spectrum of from mixed all the way to real and virtual?
So augmented reality, for those that don't know, is you're wearing normal glasses that let light in from the physical room, and you can overlay digital stuff on top so that everyone in this room, I could see a name tag floating over your head. My lab is tunnel visioned on AR right now. We have 2 brilliant grad students. That's all they're doing. When I started doing VR research, it was in 1999. It was new, but there were still 300, maybe 500 published studies on psychology of VR. When you get to AR, there are some studies about usability, about kind of perceptual features, but the kind of work that I do, which is what is the effect of me being in this room, real people, and then there's a virtual person right here, how does that change the way that I exist in the world? There's almost nothing. So my collaborator, Greg Welch at University of Central Florida, he and I have collaborated on, we just published our first study, which asks what happens when in AR, a virtual human breaks physics. She walks through chairs and stuff, how that affects how you deal with that person later on. The work we're doing in my lab right now, There's just there's so many questions to address. We're kind of sprinting on this because there's no academic research. We're asking the question, if you think about what people are going to do in AR, it's not going to be mundane stuff. In other words, I'm not going to bother to go into AR to do things that are boring. You're going to do really intense things. That's what you do in VR, good or bad. If you go to your own life and think about the best thing that's ever happened to you or the worst thing that's ever happened to you, you can really imagine that place. And if you go to the place, you're going to have some emotion. And so the questions we're answering now are, when you have an event occur to you in AR, later on, how do you feel about the space itself? Because you're going to see people doing stuff in physical spaces that, are compelling. And how does that affect the way we live in the world? And so I'm tunnel visioned on this as a lab. We just don't know that much. Yeah, thanks. Hey.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I have a question. So how do you see the future of VR playing in people doing work? How does the VR affect people everyday work?
So where I can answer with great confidence is in the training. Right, so we talked about the Walmart example. Fidelity is using VR to help its people in call centers have better empathy with the people that they're talking to on the phone, so that they can basically beam into their living rooms. I think that's one aspect, training people to be better at their jobs. I truly believe the commuting one it's going to be transformational. Now, it's only going to work if VR is good enough that we can feel this magic, what we call social presence, but the money companies will save, because you don't have to fly someone halfway across the planet for a 1 hour long meeting. You don't lose that hour on each end of the commute. I think it's going to be spectacular. But I will say, I always try to be careful. There's just a lot of things that don't need to be in VR, right? So most of your daily work is going to be just fine on the computer. You don't have to gratuitously stick it in VR. And a nice data point here is when we went through the Walmart handbook, they've got this amazing handbook on how to train at Walmart and how to do your job better. We had choices of hundreds and hundreds of anecdotes. We didn't build hundreds. We built a dozen because we wanted to focus on the things that are going to be great in VR. For example, things that require you to look around, things that might be dangerous to do in the real world. There's things that work in VR, and it's really not for everything. I hope if there's any lesson that comes out of this talk, I do not believe we should use VR for everything. Let's save it for the things that work. So the two answers to your question, training and productivity, because you can take more meetings and you don't lose a commute.
I agree with a lot of what you're saying about what's possible in VR, and as well as what you said in relation to film, how it took a certain amount of time before you have a masterpiece type of a film. I was wondering if your lab offers grants to content creators in that realm, like specifically in relation to like film or art, or if you know of any in this way, because I agree with you that it does, the level of it rising depends on content creation, is what you said. So wondering if there are any possibilities in that you would give to independent artists or filmmakers.
So what my lab does, first of all, is we give pro bono advice to just about any artist who asks. We give free tours to people who are in the Bay Area that want to get the deep dive on what works and what doesn't. I'm happy to share with you the syllabus. We pioneered a course at Stanford called immersive journalism, and this was it wasn't just about journalism, it was about storytelling. And it was what we did in the classes. We didn't do technology. We had a bunch of really smart storytellers. There was actually a woman named Jerry Miglitz and Janine Zakaria that co-taught the class, really amazing storytellers. We just critiqued everything that had ever been done, and we pulled things that worked and that didn't, and I'm happy to share that syllabus with you.
I think this is a great case study, what you're saying. And what I was asking was, say, for example, I'm an artist,
yes,
and I'm a content creator, and
yeah,
I know how to create a story with empathy or something. How do I get a grant to do that? That was sort of the question. Or if I know somebody who's can do something with virtual reality that hasn't been done, like you've talked about, a small form of like this about homelessness.
Yeah.
Some other situations, how does an artist get a grant to do something
so
like
so
this?
I'll answer
but
what I
not
know.
from like a company perspective, to like something like Google. I'm thinking outside of.
Yeah, so I'll answer what I know, because I'm a very bad artist and a decent social scientist. The foundations have been really supportive to me. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Gordon Betty Moore Foundation, Mayfield Foundation, the Mayday Foundation. If your content aligns with their topics, there's good money for that, and you can make small money go a long way these days. The other thing I will think about is the large organizations. So my lab, I've hosted visits from, just this year, probably a dozen nonprofits ranging from Planned Parenthood to the World Wildlife Foundation to the Red Cross. They're all looking for virtual reality simulations that can help them get their message out. That being said, they all tend to have their own storytellers, so they tend to be looking for support on the code side. However, I truly believe that creating good narrative is the roadblock in a lot of ways. So I would just ask early and often and have a thick skin on the nose.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Apologies in advance if you actually do answer this in your book, but so when you talk about using your technology to show people what the effects of climate change or deforestation are by having them cut down a tree or experience a single natural disaster, how does that scale up from, okay, I cut down a tree to, oh my God, we are actually getting rid of rainforests? Because one person cutting down one tree on its own doesn't seem like it would have that effect.
So one of my appointments at Stanford, I'm a senior fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment, and we think a lot about how to communicate climate change in the sense that it is frustrating that one person, we can do better, but we can't solve the problem. And the two answers I have to that are, one is it's still good to do better, and changing the car you drive and what you eat every day can make some type of a difference. The second answer is that, I can talk about under the previous administration, I spent a lot of time working with USAID, and these were building virtual simulations to target leaders in the developing nations, because the truth is climate change is here now, and we have to focus on adaptation.
Right.
And so we do a lot of work on, Palau, they can't reduce their carbon footprint and expect that to change anything. They only have 20,000 people. They can stop the commercial farming to prevent runoff that kills the reefs. They can regulate commercial fishing a little bit more.
Right, but I guess my question is more from a psychological standpoint. Like, for your Palau example, you can actually show them through an 8-minute scuba dive that with time lapse the effects of their current environment over time. Yeah. But one person cutting down one tree in that one restricted simulation, that's not going to show the full effect in the immersive environment. So
Yep. So
that's my question. How does that scale up psychologically?
Yes. So the two answers to that are, that's why so the early work had to give me the confidence as a scientist to know that this stuff actually, as a medium, is effective. And so a lot of that's early work, that the tree study, again, is over a decade old now, is just to prove to myself that it's okay to actually go to larger upscale type simulations. The second answer is, I don't think VR is great for the macro stuff. And so, on the climate change side, when you've got to learn about all these complex systems where you're seeing how weather patterns, use a computer for that. Like, VR is not for everything, and the computers work really well. The best online learning materials, in my humble opinion, is Chris Deedy's. He's a Harvard psychologist. He's got something called EcoMove and River City, and he's hundreds of thousands of students, and he's shown real differences in learning from that. And it's a complicated thing where you're running experiments and talking to other people, and they're in there for hours. You don't want to be in VR for hours. So for the macro stuff, I don't want to cheapen the science and to kind of this aha moment that's a 5-minute thing. The way that I think about it, let's do the macro stuff. You learn these complex relationships, then go in VR and experience the intensity of it. And you can go back.
Okay, I see. So it's more about making people feel like they are part of the problem directly.
Well, I think we should continue to talk about everything it's good for. Right. So with the leaders, that's why I brought up Palau. This was not for the citizens. This was for the 26 people who are making the laws in Palau. Right. And that scales, right? So yes. When it comes to citizen, so when I worked with USAID, we were trying to brainstorm where we can be helpful to give leaders of countries more information to make better informed decisions about their climate policies or their adaptation policies.
And what about the opposite issue that, for instance, in the empathy at the beginning, the opposite issue would be if somebody sees that the reflection has changed, what happens if the shock of seeing that change cancels out the rest of the experience?
So we pilot test a lot with this stuff, and we make mistakes early on with small samples. When we ever present a study, it's usually because we failed a dozen times, and what we end up presenting is, not from a statistical sense for those who pay attention to p-hacking, in informal pilot studies qualitatively, we do designing and we find out what is going to not cause that shock to take you out of the experience.
Okay, so I would just have to get a little bit more nuanced insight into exactly what you did, and I assume that book provides that.
Yes, however, no. This is in its infancy. You know, I'm presenting my work, and I'm trying not to present it as if we've discovered everything. Most academic fields have got hundreds, if not thousands, of people converging on a topic. In the history of VR social science, there's about 4 of us.
Right, and I actually appreciate this talk for that attitude that you present it with.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate your questions.
All right, thank you all for coming, and let's please thank our speaker as well.